The Wasp Factory. Chapter 5. A Bunch of Flowers. Part 3. I didn't take any notice of him. I kept staring and shivering and clutching the flowers. My father and Diggs came along after the young man passed word along the line of people beating their way along the dunes, but I didn't take any notice of those two either. Eventually, there were dozens of people clustered around me, looking at me, asking me questions, scratching their heads, looking at their watches, gazing about. I didn't take any notice of them. They formed their line again and started searching for Esmeralda while I was carried back to the house. They offered me soup I was desperate for but took no notice of. Asked me questions I answered with a catatonic silence and stare. My uncle and aunt shook me, their faces red and eyes wet, but I took no notice of them. Eventually, my father took me to my room, undressed me, put me to bed. Somebody stayed in my room all night, and whether it was my father, Diggs, or anybody else, I kept them and me awake all night by lying quiet for a while, feigning sleep, then screaming with all my might and falling out of bed to thrash about the floor. Each time I was picked up, cuddled, and put back to bed. Each time I pretended to go back to sleep again and went crazy after a few minutes. If any of them talked to me, I lay shaking in the bed, staring at them, soundless and deaf. I kept that up until dawn, when the search party returned Esmeralda-less. Then I let myself go to sleep. It took me a week to recover, and it was one of the best weeks of my life. Eric came back from his school cruise and started to talk a little after he arrived. Just nonsense at first, then later disjointed hints at what had happened, always followed by screaming and catatonia. Sometime around the middle of the week, Dr. McLennan was allowed to see me for a while, after Diggs overruled my father's refusal to have me medically inspected by anybody else but him. Even so, he stayed in the room, glowering and suspicious, making sure that the examination was kept within certain limits. I was glad he didn't let the doctor look all over me, and I responded by becoming a little more lucid. By the end of the week, I was still having the occasional fake nightmare. I would suddenly go very quiet and shivery every now and again. But as I was eating more or less normally and could answer most questions quite happily, talking about Esmeralda and what had happened to her, I still brought on many fits and screams and total withdrawal for a while. But after long and patient questioning my father and Diggs, I let them know what I wanted them to think had happened. A big kite, Esmeralda becoming entangled in the lines, me trying to help her, and the winch slipping out of my fingers, desperate, running, and then a blank. I explained that I was afraid I was jinxed, that I brought death and destruction upon all those near me, and also that I was afraid I might get sent to prison because people who think I had murdered Esmeralda. I went and I hugged my father, and I even hugged Diggs, smelling his hard blue uniform fabric as I did so, and almost feeling him melt and believe me. I asked him to go to the shed and take all my kites away and burn them, which he duly did, in a hollow now called Kite Prior Dell. I was sorry about the kites, and I knew that I'd have to give up flying them for good to keep the act looking realistic, but it was worth it. Esmeralda never did show up. Nobody saw her after me, as far as Diggs's inquiries of trawlers and drilling rigs and so on could show. So I got to even up the score and have a wonderful, if demanding, week of fun acting. The flowers that I had still been clutching when they carried me back to the house had been prized from my fingers and left in a plastic bag on top of the fridge. I discovered them there, shriveled and dead, forgotten and unnoticed 2 weeks later. I took them for the shrine in the loft one night and have them to this day, little brown twists of dried plant like sellotape stuck in a little glass bottle. I wonder sometimes where my cousin ended up, the bottom of the sea or washed on to some craggy and deserted shore, or blown on to a high mountain face to be eaten by gulls or eagles. I would like to think that she died still being floated by the giant kite, that she went around the world and rose higher as she did rose higher as she died of starvation and dehydration, and so grew less weighty still to become eventually a tiny skeleton riding the jet streams of the planet, a sort of flying Dutchwoman, but I doubt that such a romantic vision really matches the truth. I spent most of Sunday in bed after my binge of the previous night. I wanted rest, lots of liquid, little food, and my hangover to go away. I felt like deciding then and there never to get drunk again, but being so young, I decided this was probably a little unrealistic. So I was determined not to get that drunk again. My father came and banged at the door, and I didn't appear for breakfast. And what's wrong with you as if I need ask? Nothing. I croaked at the door. That'll be right, my father said sarcastically. And how much did you have to drink last night? Not much. He said. I'll be down soon, I said, and rocked to and fro in the bed to make noises which might make it sound as though I was getting up. Was that you on the phone last night? What? I asked at the door, stopping my rocking. It was, wasn't it? I thought it was you. You were trying to disguise your voice. What were you doing ringing at that time? I don't remember ringing, Dad, honest, I said carefully. Uh-huh. You're a fool, boy, he said, and clumped off down the hall. I lay there thinking. I was quite sure I hadn't called the house that previous night. I had been with Jamie in the pub, then with him and the girl outside, then alone when I was running, and then with Jamie and later him and his mother. Then I walked home almost sober. There were no blank spots. I assumed it must have been Eric calling. From the sound of it, my father couldn't have spoken to him for very long, or he would have recognized his son's voice. I lay back in my bed, hoping that Eric was still at large and heading this way, and also that my head and guts would stop reminding me how uncomfortable they could feel.